in these fights that feel endless. Mark highlights how activism takes so many different forms. But in order to sustain ourselves in the struggle, we have to learn to get quiet and allow the magic of nature to resource us. I'm hoping that you guys find Mark wherever Mark is and can download one of his meditations. It would be a perfect pairing for this episode, and I'm just really excited to have had him here sharing his magic with you.
Who's going to be listening?
Well, today, just Julia. And so Julia's on the call. She's going to take show notes. So when we post the episode, everything that you and I kind of mention and reference will go and hyperlink for folks so they can go and do deeper research. This podcast is the brainchild of the Center for Food Safety's executive director, Andrew Kimbrell, who wanted to bring the communication strategy for CFS kind of into the 2022s. Mm-hmm. And he gave myself and Julia full license to kind of imagine what we thought would be a compelling podcast that could touch on what CFS does. And just to remind you, CFS is primarily a law firm, mm-hmm. and we litigate at the intersection of ag and the environment. Mm-hmm. So we tend to be one of the leading organizations suing the federal government when they fail to properly protect communities from industrial ag.
That's a busy job. That's a big remit.
Totally. And we're a small organization. And so our impact is far bigger than what people imagine our staff size to be. But it's been a really lovely home for me because I get to kind of do whatever I want. And Andrew is very entrepreneurial. So he likes to do new things. And as you know, I thrive in new stuff. So we decided, Julia and I, that it would be more interesting for us to focus on individual stories of activism, tenacity, perseverance over and above the topical issues that frame CFS's work. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of, I think, a conclusion that I've reached as a longtime environmental activist that has reached sometimes my own points of exhaustion and burnout and impasse, and yet nevertheless persist. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we need in this moment is stories of persistence. Mm-hmm. And there are so many different ways that people arrive at this work. And this work for me is protecting Mother Earth. Right. And we've cast a really broad net for who we've invited onto the podcast: academics, lawyers, so some of the matriarchs of the food movement, Marian Nessel, Vandana Shiva. We have a episode with her later this week.
Cool.
And it will be distributed through all the typical podcast channels and through CFS's membership, which we claim to have 1 million members. I'm not sure who those members are and
where they come from.
Yeah. And if they're bots in Pakistan, but no judgment. Everybody wants to know. Now we have at least 500,000 kind of active users of our email list.
That's cool. It's big.
And we have a, growing social presence. Julia just sort of joined a team of mine in Hawaii, and we're kind of revamping social for the organization. And you came to mind, I think, not only because I'm your super fan, but also because I do want to explore mindfulness as one of the tools in the toolkit for this broader question of like perseverance and presence and endurance in a fight that seems
long term.
long term. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I thought we could start, I mean, and I don't even know if I know these answers, like sort of with your biographics, sort of the basics, like where you're from, where you grew up, sort of what landscapes shaped you as a younger person, although you're still young.
Youngish.
Youngish.
Is that a question you want to start with,
Yeah.
or
Yeah,
yeah?
just roll in.
Yeah. So I was born in Kent in a little town called Birchington-on-Sea, which is in the southeast of England. But I don't have a lot of memories from that time, except it was by the sea. It was England by the seaside. So a lot of time at the seaside. And then mostly grew up in Newcastle, in actually in Whitley Bay, which is a coastal town in northern England in Northumberland, not far from the Scottish border, and pretty wild country. Beautiful windswept beaches, big sand dunes, and I grew up in the edge of the suburbs adjacent to farmland, and so a lot of my misspent youth was in farms and running around wheat fields and in the woods and in streams and just playing a lot outside. But particularly, it was very oriented around farms and that just the influence of agriculture, small, not big ag like here, but small family farms. And I didn't know farmers. I just played in their fields and sometimes caused havoc. I had a phase of being a little young arsonist, and we played a lot with fire and mostly with stubble because they burnt the wheat fields back then, the stubble. And but yeah, just playing. And actually, one of my pivotal memories, really, which kind of informed a lot of my nature work, was we used to. And I remember I was just in England a few weeks ago, and I was looking at the way the wheat fields are when they're fully ripe, and we used to make these little tunnels, or the tunnels would already be made by the wind, and we would sort of shuffle out on our bellies out to the middle of a wheat field, and then lie down, and like, because we couldn't be seen, right? Well, we thought we couldn't be seen. We probably could, but I was like 7, 8, 9, and it was some of my most blissful memories was just lying down in these beautiful ripened fields of wheat and barley, and the stalks swaying and the swallows flitting around and the clouds rolling by, and there were just these sort of idyllic memories of childhood in the country where everything felt right. Home life didn't always feel like that by any means, but being outdoors, either in the woods, in the forest, along the ocean, well, it's not the ocean, the English Channel, North Sea actually, and in these fields there was a certain kind of peacefulness. I didn't have language for that. It's just like, oh, it was cool, it's what I did. But actually, I think looking back, I felt a lot of well-being and a lot of peace and a lot of ease, feeling held, feeling connected, and touched by beauty. Beautiful forests and beautiful these golden fields of wheat. And so that was very much influenced my early years. And then at some point we left and we went to London, and I went to college in London, and it had a period of about 10 years, very urban, mostly in the East End of London, which back then in the 80s and 90s was really gritty. It was run down, it was depressed, it was poor, it was working class and impoverished. Now it's become hipster central, but then it was very rough. And I used to eke out any kind of nature I could find, grass in the sidewalk, literally, the London plane trees that survived the war. And then there's great parks in London, so I'd go to Hampstead Heath a lot. And that became my refuge of finding nature amidst the pretty grey urban landscape. And then eventually I went to Asia to study meditation and find different teachers and to trace Buddhist roots in India and Nepal and Thailand and beyond. And eventually made my way to the States in the 90s. And then got a camper van, picked up a cheap camper van in Florida, and just drove around the country and spent a lot of time falling in love with the wilderness and the Rocky Mountains and the Eastern Seaboard, but mostly more the mountains, the Rockies, the Sierras, the deserts of the Southwest. Just became completely enchanted by the vastness of wilderness. You know, in England and in Europe, the nature is quite beautiful, but it's very cultivated and you know, messed with in a certain way. And there's a lot of wilderness in the States, a lot of wild forests and deserts and mountains, and that's when I started taking my meditation practice outside, because why would I not want to meditate with giant redwoods and ancient sequoias and beautiful mountains and silent deserts and rugged coastlines? And so that's where my own nature meditation practice took off for most of the 90s. And ever since, really, I mostly prefer to meditate outside. And yeah, and I can share more about how that led into teaching, but that's another track.
Yeah, I was talking with a friend this morning. I was sort of captivated by this image of you laying in the wheat field at 8, 9, 10 years old, you know, thinking that no one could see you, and remembering my own childhood. I used to hide in people's bushes in their yards and build these homes for myself. And now I wonder, like, what was it like for that homeowner that there's this 7-year-old little girl every day, like building her reality in their bush, you know? But that sense of wonder is, I think, what I have recovered in my own nature-based meditation practice is like, oh my God, like, wait, everybody slow down. Like, look at this flower. It's amazing.
Right.
And I don't know. I mean, we could probably talk all day about how we lose that, but that wonder for me is like the fuel for something.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that's my next question for you, because mindfulness, like, why don't you explain to folks? I don't even know if we'll have meditators listening in. Like, what is mindfulness? What is meditation generally for you? And how did you find yourself wandering through the world, getting curious about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so I'll start with my story. So I was in London. I was a student, and I was very disenchanted with life and society. I was very politically aware of injustice, racism, classism, particularly in England, and the impacts of globalization. And so I was very involved politically, and whether it was with, and back then it was dealing with the Thatcher government and her trying to break up the unions, and so defending the coal miners, ironically, but that was a big social rift back in the early 80s, destroying the coal mining unions. And so that search of looking for understanding of why society was so messed up and why there was so much injustice and pain and inequality, and I felt very viscerally the suffering of that, and that kind of just got me searching for, why is society so messed up? Why are people so messed up? And why am I so messed up? Why am I confused and suffering and in pain and not really understanding why, and being angry and blaming and judging and acting out as I did. And at some point, I was squatting these houses as part of a social movement And also it was free housing for me as a student, which kind of worked kind of conveniently. And it was fun and exciting, and there was all this massive amount of empty public housing stock, so we took it over as a political act. And I ended up squatting, unbeknownst to me, a Buddhist, it was public stock, housing stock, but it was run by a Buddhist housing co-op. And I got to know them, and I had legal rights to stay, so they couldn't kick me out, so I got to know them quite well. And they happened to have a Buddhist center in Bethnal Green, which back then was a very, very traditional working class neighborhood, and very odd place for a Buddhist retreat center. The Buddhist center, the only place in London actually there was a Buddhist meditation center. And at some point I got curious because I liked the people, and they said, go check it out, see what's going on. And I walked in, and I saw there's these people in the center, and they just had a certain presence. They had a certain peacefulness, or what I now understand as embodiment and a mindful awareness. And there was something that struck me, and I didn't know what it was, but I knew I wanted what they were experiencing. And so I started meditating, and meditating was very radical, and it is radical. It's a radical confrontation with yourself. It's a turning of the lens of attention from the external orientation to life and whatever, relationships, and to understanding and looking at your own mind and heart. And I realized very quickly that a lot of my suffering was going on in here, and not because of what was happening around me. And so that really piqued my curiosity. I started, and the first meditation I learned was mindfulness, and also loving kindness. And so those were very, very powerful practices that I've been doing ever since in different forms. And mindfulness, to get back to your earlier question, is really simply being aware of what's happening, noticing what's happening in your inner and outer experience, whether that's your physical experience, physical, emotional, mental, psychological, environmental, social, relational experience. It's simply being aware, conscious, knowing what's happening. And we all have that faculty, otherwise we wouldn't be able to function. I wouldn't be able to lift up a glass of water and drink. It'd go in my ear instead of my mouth. It's a basic awareness of that, the physical proprioceptive awareness. And at the same time, we all know that, when we spend half our time on these things or on other screens, or just being busy and multitasking and rushing and all the stresses that we live under, our attention gets fractured, distracted, and it becomes harder to pay attention, harder to be mindful, harder to sustain concentration. We have a very distractible mind, partly because of the way we use technology and how that sort of fractures our attention. And so mindfulness has become very popular in the last 10 to 20 years, I'd say the particular last 10, 15 years, very much in relationship to these. The more that we live digitally oriented, screen oriented, and all of the fracturing of our attention that technology does, then our ability to stay focused and attentive and mindful and present and concentrated gets eroded. And so mindfulness in some ways is a counterbalance and a support for learning how to be present and focused and concentrated, whether it's having a conversation or being in a meeting or writing a document or an email or reading a book, right? So it's a really simple, basic human capacity that we're losing that skill. And so the rise of meditation and mindfulness and all the different attentional practices, including yoga and other qigong and other forms, they're ways to help us become more present. And then when we're present, we're much more effective. We can function better, we're better in relationship, we're better in life. And we also access a greater sense of well-being because we're in the present moment. When we can live in the present moment and not lost in our worries about the future or our regrets about the past, we actually feel a sense of well-being and ease. So, and one of the reasons I teach in nature is because one of the few places that we get really present, because it's so beautiful, we live in an amazing planet full of beauty and wonder and diversity. When we go outside, we get present much easier. It's much more easier to be mindful. You go to the beach and you're looking at the ocean waves and the birds and the sky. You don't have to work very hard to be present. Or walk in a park or in a forest or in your garden. And it's beauty and color and delight and spring and summer. And so the reason I do most of my meditation and my teaching of meditation outside, as you know, because you've studied that work with me, is it just becomes much more easy to be present, to stay focused. Because why wouldn't we want to be present in a beautiful landscape, a garden, a park, a forest, an oceanside setting?
I remember something you said on our first retreat together was that the Buddha meditated outside, and yet the movement of meditation indoors sort of followed society's movement indoors, but that wasn't necessarily where the practice was originally practiced.
Right. Yeah. I mean, back then, whether it was the Buddha or Lao Tzu or Confucius or many of the great teachers that were around the axial age 2,500 years ago, yeah, most people lived outside. They might have had some simple shelter, some simple dwelling to protect from the rain and the winters, but northern India wasn't that cold. And so they mostly lived outside. And certainly most of the meditators and the yogis, as they were called, lived outside, lived in the forest. And so he was, he and many others, born outside, lived outside, meditated outside, found awakening outside, taught outside, died outside. It was a very, very close relationship to the natural world, to the rhythms of the seasons and the day and the moon. And so I imagine he and countless others, and you look in certainly every Buddhist tradition, but I think it's true in other traditions, the meditators who went up to the Himalayas, into the caves, into the mountains, the meditators in Japan and China, and went into the mountains and beautiful gardens and forests, and the traditions in Southeast Asia, in Thailand, Thai forest tradition, where they mostly meditate in the jungle, live in the jungle, in the forest. And so you look at the poetry and the writing of a lot of spiritual teachings over the centuries, the last couple of thousand years, you can see the influence of nature and how pivotal that was for their own understanding, for their own awakening, for their own sense of connection and place and understanding our place in the web of life. And in the last few hundred years, the move indoors has, and especially the last few decades, where we've become more of an urban species than not. We're becoming increasingly alienated and separated from nature, from its rhythms, from its resource and beauty and nourishment. And the concurrent levels of stress and anxiety and depression and all that. It's not the only reason for all of those things, but I think it's a contributing factor. When we go outside, and there's great research happening now in the last 10 years, all kinds of great data. When we go outside, we feel a sense of well-being. We feel a sense of joy. We feel calmer. Our cortisol level goes down. Our blood pressure goes down. Our well-being factors go up, and that's been recorded in all kinds of different ways. And so I think we're really suffering as a species because we're cutting ourselves off from our natural habitat, really.
I'm wondering, you bring your meditation practice and your teaching outside during this time of like rapid transformation, sort of the zeitgeist, right? We not only see mindfulness going off, but we're also watching I think, a broad transformation of people's relationship to the planet because of climate change. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how your teaching has evolved in the past 10 years as you've sort of brought nature-based meditation to many, many people and then watched that practice evolve as we're all evolving.
So just to clarify the questions, can you say that? Can you rephrase that?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you can talk about how your retreats have changed over time. Because it feels to me like one of the first stories we sort of talked about when we were in Colorado together was sort of how folks like me came to your retreat with this sense of urgency like the planet is on fire.
Right.
Why are we sitting still? And you sort of remarked on how it's changed year over
Right.
year
Yeah.
as the
Yeah.
climate crisis unfolds.
Right. Right. Yeah. No,
Meditation
definitely.
has taken on a sort of new role.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, 10, 15 years ago when I would bring up the climate crisis and the ecological crisis, people didn't really want to know. Like, no, I'm here to meditate and I'm here to be in nature and have a good time. Like, okay. Or the room would just glaze over. Not the room, but that the audience would glaze. And that was true 15 years ago, even 10 years ago. But as the climate crisis has really started to impact people much more viscerally with the fires and the smoke and the droughts and the floods and the storms and all of those increasing factors here in the US and beyond, like the heat waves that are raging in Europe right now and beyond. Yeah, there's been increasing, I'd say, zeal, a passion, hunger to both understand, or a desire to know what to do, how to engage, how is this being outside in nature relevant to this broader ecological crisis, and how can it make an impact, and so there's sometimes I have to, when people come for a day or a week of practice in nature, sometimes I have to slow down the desire to naturally want to jump into that discussion and come up with solutions and strategies and engagements, because the point of the work is partly to take some time to slow down, to nourish ourselves, to open up our senses, to reconnect in a very visceral, tangible, sensory way with the natural world that we're so concerned about protecting and defending and preserving and regenerating. But it's very easy to get lost in our minds and concepts about all of that, and actually to forget what it is that we're trying to protect. And I've worked with a lot of environmental activists for decades now, and who work in DC and other places, who are very much on the front lines, lobbying, litigating, protecting, and educating, but may not have spent time out in the forest or in the mountains or in deep nature for a long time, because they're very focused on their work. And so it's almost like cutting off the lifeline to that which is actually nourishing us and healing us and loving us and inspiring us to do the work in the first place. So I think it's important that particularly people who are engaged in environmental work, but also for anybody, and this is really the orientation of my work, is to the importance of taking time to go outside, whether it's your garden or a park or a woodland or a meadow or a farm or anywhere that's less impacted by human intervention and has more, natural life going on in it, to let ourselves be influenced by that. And when we're influenced by the natural world, we tend to feel nourished and connected and more loving, more open, more joy, more we learn about resilience and inner sustainability, and then from the place of being connected and in love and immersed in nature, then that becomes a very rich place for then reflecting, as I have students reflect at the end of a period of practice. how does the earth want to move through you? How does the earth want to, move and inspire your work and your life and your choices and your lifestyle and your and so I think it's important that we take time to reconnect with that which we're loving and protecting, both to nourish us, because this is, as anybody knows, that the environmental work that we have ahead of us is lifetimes of work. And so how do we stay resourced and nourished and not to get contracted into anger and bitterness or fear or hatred, which don't become very personally sustainable emotions to engage in a long-term action.
I remember writing in my journal on our first retreat, how does the earth want to move through you? Just that as sort of a meditation in itself and an attunement, right? How do we start to develop our awareness of that movement and that sort of the gentle speaking of the earth is not something that can be heard in the busyness of sort of our modern lives. And so kind of clearing out the space for that, I think, is really, it's hard work, but it's pretty vital. I'm wondering how nature-based meditation then has transformed your practice as an activist. I mean, coming out of the gritty union busting work of East London to today, sort of being a part of a very rich spiritual community, how you see your activism today and like what's fueling that and nourishing it probably is the better verb.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, and I certainly reflect a lot about that, and just was having some conversations on. I just was graduating another cohort of people leading this work, the Awaken the Wild work that I guide, and then I was reflecting on how, in my my teens and 20s and early 30s, I was much more, what would be considered a frontline activist, demonstrator, going up to Humboldt redwoods and protesting against the logging of old growth up there in Humboldt County, and just sort of being more active in terms of demonstrating and rallying and trying to raise awareness about what was happening locally, California, where I was living. I'm still living. And being part of organizations that were involved in direct action, and a bit like the way XR is Extinction Rebellion is now. And then as my work has grown, my meditation teaching and particularly my nature meditation teaching, that is pretty all-consuming for me in terms of my work and time and energy. And so what's shifted with that is realizing that the work that I do, taking people out into nature, working with activists, working with social workers, teachers, and the community is its own form of quiet activism. It's not direct action by any means. It's very indirect. I'm spending my life taking people outside into nature, both accessible, like locally I'll work in the state park behind my house, to going out into deep wilderness with people in groups, and putting my faith and trust in that, taking people deep into nature with a contemplative practice, tools to learn how to be really deeply present in nature and listen deeply to the earth and species. That will inspire people to both to shift their consciousness, to wake up, to realize that we are the earth, that we're not separate from the earth, and that what we do is an expression of the earth, and a trust and a hope and a wish that that deep connection and people falling in love more deeply with the earth and species of the earth will actually lead to constructive change, whether that's personal change or whether that'll inspire them to do more with their resources, philanthropy and otherwise, or to get engaged socially and politically with organizations, to protect the earth in different ways, to change the way they vote. So I see it as indirectly supporting people to wake up to the earth and the preciousness. And of course, when we wake up to the preciousness and we open our hearts, we also realize what we're losing. Just the massive loss of species and the degradation of ecosystems. And so people also feel more the impact of human action. And so I think people are more likely to open up to deeper states of grief and sadness and loss and rage and I think it's important that people also feel response to what's happening, not just to think about it and not just to act around it, but also to feel, because we generally are motivated by our emotions. And when we don't feel, it's unhealthy for one thing, and we cut off the source of action. So I think all of that, is sort of my contribution. And I was really clear, and I was teaching this last week, that we all have our lane. We all have our work, right? And you have your work, and this is majority of my work is doing this and then training people to do this work. So therefore, scaling the impact of how many people can be taken outside, contemplative, whether that's leaders or activists or whatever, and trusting that has its own impact over time. And at least the minimum is supporting and nourishing people who are doing good work in the field. Right?
I'm wondering if you can touch a little bit about the role of silence in your work, because it's something that I deeply, deeply appreciate. And I see it as kind of integral, because many of us go on hikes with our friends where we're chatting and having a great time. For me, moving and connecting go together. But you also bring people into nature for long periods of time in silence. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about the role of silence in the kind of total toolkit of presence building.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, I think one of the things that distinguishes my work is the treasuring of silence. So yeah, whether I'm taking people out for an hour, a half day, a day, a week, 10 days, the majority of it is in silence, which is primarily social silence. So we're not chatting, we're not hanging out, we're not, telling our stories. We're getting quiet, we're closing our mouth, literally, for the most part. I mean, we have questions and discussions and that, but for the most part, we are outdoors without social conversation. And what that does a few things. One is it allows our mind to get quiet. When we engage in conversation, it's stimulating. And so when we're not talking, that can quiet. Our personality can quiet down because we're not engaged with, who I am and who are you and what do I do and all of that stuff. But more importantly, when we get quiet, when we quieten down our words and our mind, and we're in a group that's quiet, then a few things happen. One, we get to have our own intimate experience with nature together. So we can be alone together. We can be a group of 20, 50, we've had 100 people out. And when we're silent, we have much less impact. We're just organic life, sitting and moving and walking. And we tend, nature, even though can be quite loud and cacophonous, is often quite quiet. Animals are mostly quiet. Trees are mostly quiet, right? Grasses, plants are quiet. And so we can attend and attune and actually listen and feel and see much more. Right? When if we're a busy group of 20 people chatting, you'll guarantee the wildlife, the animals, birds will scatter. Right? You won't see much, and people have to say, "I don't see much out here." Well, because you're talking the whole time. you know. So there's that. I've taken groups, large groups of 30 people. We've walked through the mountains in New Mexico and come across packs of wild horses or elk or foxes and coyotes cross our path because then we're not so intimidating. But I think more importantly, when we're silent, we can connect much more deeply to nature, to the energy of a place, to the stillness, to the sounds, to the smells, to the more subtle layers of experience. And in that silence and that quieting down, we become more intimate with nature. We become more connected. And for me, silence from the meditation path, silence is a doorway. When we enter like into a silent forest, like I was just hiking in Sequoia National Park. I'd get up at 5 in the morning, and I'd go into the what's it called, giant grove of the giants. This beautiful grove of sequoia trees, a few square miles, and 1,000, 2,000 year old trees and beautiful groves. And I'd go up and I'd get there at 6 in the morning, and I'd have 3 to 4 hours where the people wouldn't get up there very early. And so I'd have 3 or 4 hours of just this exquisitely serene silence. There's just the trees, maybe the wind blowing, but this stillness. And in that silence and stillness is something so profound. So it feels very ancient. It feels like I'm going back to a time where there weren't many humans chatting and yakking, and it's just trees, and these trees are ancient, 2,000-year-old ancient silent ones. And so in that silence, for me, and I think for others, a profound way to feel and connect much more deeply with the natural world, and to be touched by and influenced by the natural world. And so I'm a big proponent of having quiet time outside.
Mm. Yeah, I also feel like the ability to be silent is a skill
Mm-hmm.
that we're not taught,
Right.
and something that my own silent practice has helped me attune to is how the ability to just talk constantly prevents me from listening.
Yeah.
And just that practice of like, it's not my time. It's just my time to be, to listen, to
Mm-hmm.
observe. I think it's something that maybe introverts have naturally, but extroverts need to learn.
Right.
Um,
Definitely. Yeah.
and to kind of graft back to the sort of question of the hour, which is, what do we need in this moment to sort of build a long-term strategy for Earth resilience,
Mm-hmm.
the ability to listen and attune to others, um, is certainly something we're missing in the broader political discourse.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, and I think mindfulness, really, you can think of mindfulness as a form of deep listening,
Mm.
listening to ourselves, listening to each other, listening to our bodies, to our hearts, to life. And so when we take our mindfulness practice outside in nature, we're also learning to deeply listen. Listen with all of our senses, not just our ears, but listen to the whole ecosystem, and also learning to listen to the broader ecology of life. And so mindfulness and listening and silence and an effective responsiveness, they kind of intermingle, right? When we can truly listen to ourselves, to the earth, to each other, we're more likely to have an effective response than just whatever our mind thinks is a good idea.
Mm. I'm thinking about the sort of effects of the work and sort of what we're encouraging by bringing folks, activists, everyday people, philanthropists into nature and tuning them in to themselves and to the natural world. Um, and I know a lot of your work has actually been happening on farms and sort of in these foodscapes. And I'm thinking about the ranch that we were on together in Northern California. And I mean, just for our listeners, I want you to know that when I drove up to this ranch, my first response was, ew, this is ugly. Like, I don't want to be here. It was really dry. And as somebody who lives in Hawaii, I'm used to lush green vibrancy. And this is a very dry ranch that was undergoing sort of its own restoration process. But after a week of being there, it felt like the most beautiful place in the world. Like I could just really see all of the beauty in its own, in the ways that it manifests there. I'm wondering if you can talk about that, like sort of bringing people to places that are unexpected, that are, that one wouldn't think you would go to a meditation retreat on a ranch, and sort of what that work has done for your students and yourself.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. It's funny. I was just visiting a ranch a couple of days ago, similar, a neighboring ranch to where we did that retreat, and we were walking around and had similar experience of, like, it's July, it's dry, it's hot, and the grasses have, basically gone to seed and dried up, and it doesn't feel or look very nourishing. It feels not dead, but just not fecund like Hawaii or how it feels in spring. And it's been a common experience when I've gone to many places, particularly in California, which has a green season and a dry season. And we get to a place like the ranch or like a woodland, and it looks and feels dry, and the grasses look dead, and still the trees are very much alive, and the oaks and the bays and the buckeye trees are thriving. And what's always profound for me whenever I get to a place, solo or with a group, and we spend, it only has to really be a few hours, but of course the longer time we spend, like a day or a few days, like we did at the ranch for a week, you start to feel into the life and the rhythm of the land and the beauty. And I remember, I think you asked, or somebody asked, Lisa Marie, who was one of the regenerative farmers, like, it seems so dead here. And she's like, no, like, these grasses, they lay dormant for 6 to 8 months until the first rains, and then suddenly within weeks the whole valley is carpeted in emerald green grassland. It's beautiful. And so it's in a different, it's in a dormant phase, the soil and so I think what I appreciate about that is, no matter where we go, if we first let go of our expectations, or our comparing mind, like, oh well, it's not Hawaii, I don't like it, it's brown, it's dry, and actually drop into what it is, and we actually get quiet and slow down enough to appreciate the rocks and the grasslands and the contours of the hills and the tenacity of the oaks and the bays and whatnot. Like, everywhere has its own beauty. Like, I for me, when I first came to the States, I would do these retreats for myself first, and I'd work on these retreats in Yucca Valley in the desert, by Joshua Tree and National Monument. And again, my first experience, like, oh, desert's kind of like, oh, it's kind of scrubby and dry and rocky and harsh and barren. And then, of course, what I've come to love about the Southwest is, and I always feel that the desert reveals her secrets very slowly, and it takes time. You just have to take time to wake up at dawn and feel and listen to the songbirds and then walk out amongst the cacti and the Joshua trees or whatever the flora is there, And you actually see it's really quite fecund. It's incredibly resilient, harsh, but incredibly tenacious life of insects and plants and animals. And so again, when we bring mindfulness and presence and silence and receptivity, everywhere that's unadulterated by human activity, anywhere natural has its own beauty. It might not be our preferred place, right, to live or to hang out, but it has its own beauty. And I think mindfulness practice helps us attune to being able to see the beauty and the intelligence of life and how it adjusts to deserts and mountains and wetlands and whatnot.
Mark, I'm wondering if you can talk about your challenges. I mean, we've spent the good part of the hour kind of talking about the aliveness of the work, how it sort of organically evolved and rooted you, and you've been able to kind of expand the work both through your teacher trainings and just the popularity of your retreats and the venues that Mark offers his teachings through, like Spirit Rock. You're reaching more and more people. But part of my question is like, how do we stick at this? Like, what has been challenging you as you've continued the work, and like, how do you stay in it when it's so hard, I think, to stay at work that's this patient, um, in a landscape that's increasingly challenged. I know you've sort of been chased out of more than one retreat location recently,
Yeah.
due to fires and floods. And so,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. Well, I mean, I love the work and I love being outside and I love turning people on to being in nature in a contemplative way. So it's in that respect that's the easy part, right? It's a joy, and and like any work, it's work and it has its demands, and it can be tiring, and I can do too much, and and get imbalanced. But as you point to, the one of the challenges these days is finding places to do the work, because so many places in ecosystems that are really challenged, right? So I had to move a venue 3 times last year because I was going to do it on Mount Shasta and we were chased out by the fires. I was going to do it. I moved it down to the South Bay to Henry Coe State Park, and it was completely drought stricken, no water. It was a tinderbox waiting to, in flame. And I ended up moving to the ranch that you did the retreat with in Nicasio. And the same thing happened this year. I was about to lead a retreat on a beautiful 40,000 acre ranch that a friend of mine owns part of it. And he lost 25,000 acres to a forest fire in New Mexico, and very tragic. And I'd walked that land, several times in just during my reconnaissance. So that's one of the challenges, is finding places that are not going to be adversely affected either by fires, by smoke, less impacted by droughts and tornadoes and hurricanes. This coastline, and so that's one of the challenges. I think another challenge is how to make this work relevant in an increasingly heating planet. How to make those connections. Another challenge is how to do this work and not have a huge carbon footprint, personal carbon footprint. So if I'm flying somewhere to do a retreat, there's some incongruousness to it. Even though I do carbon offsets and all of that, it still feels like, in an ideal world, I'd be teaching this work in the Bay Area that I can bike or drive to in my electric car, and having a very low carbon footprint. And other people would be coming locally. But then what about you who wants to come from Hawaii or someone from the East Coast? And so that's one of the sort of inherent challenges for me around how do I balance the carbon footprint of the work and in contrast to the positive impact of the work. So, and then of course there's the challenge of how to make this work more accessible, you know, to underserved communities, particularly to inner city communities, to youth. And I'm right now in the middle of looking for scholarships and grants and to foundations to try and find ways to get more funding so I can actually, not just me, but my graduates share this work with communities that really need it. You know. So there's some of the challenges.
How do you deal then with like the anger that comes up in all of us as we're watching our planet sort of endure what it's enduring based on human behavior? Like, or how do you deal with your own frustration or fatigue at chasing a place around so that you can have a retreat?
Yeah, yeah. Well, the definitely feel anger. Definitely feel. Mostly, I feel disbelief to be at the inaction. You know, the Joe Manchins of this world. You know, stopping good climate legislation happening. I'm just in utter disbelief. I'm incredulous, and yeah, I get angry and I get frustrated and I feel impotent at the inability to affect any change. That's frustrated. I feel frustrated. I feel annoyed. I feel, but underneath all of that, you know, I mostly feel grief and sadness and sorrow. It's just it's just so painful to feel what we're doing to this beautiful planet and to the ecosystems and to poor peoples around the world and to species and we're just going on business as usual, and it's painful, painful, painful to see that, painful to be part of that, because I feel by just living, I'm complicit in a small way, um, and and so I think it, and I let myself feel the grief, I feel the sorrow, I feel the loss, I feel the sadness, I feel the pain, and I think it's really important that we let ourselves feel what's underneath the rage and the injustice and the anger. We feel the grief because we love this place, we love this earth, we love the species here, and let that heart opening or the heartbreak, let that make me and more committed to doing this work. It's so easy to tune out, to check out, to go unconscious, to put Netflix on, to distract ourselves. Just it's easy and sometimes necessary to take a break and go on vacation and to watch Netflix. But it's also easy to numb out, and I think that's very dangerous for us as a species and for the planet, because by numbing out we don't feel, and when we don't feel we don't act. So I definitely encourage people to open, this beautiful phrase that I think you've heard me speak about, solastalgia, which is this concurrent feeling that we often feel when we go outside now, the feeling of both going out, say, to a forest, like the redwood groves I go to here in Mill Valley, and where I would normally feel joy, I also feel sadness and despair because I feel the stress of the forest. So there's the concurrent feeling of love of the place and also the sadness and knowing what's happening to the ecosystem.
I watched the Mr. Rogers movie yesterday on the plane home from Istanbul, and something that really comes through in the movie is that what Mr. Rogers was trying to do is teach young children how to manage their feelings. And that, for Americans who tuned into Mr. Rogers, for many kids, it was the only place where one could talk about sadness and grief and pain and anger. And I do feel that our disconnection from our inner world is mirrored in our disconnection from our outer world. And while it seems kind of hairy-fairy, I think the more we can tune in here, the more we can tune in there.
Right.
And there is so much to feel right now.
Yeah, definitely. And as you say, they're connected.
Mm.
And to the extent that we're numb here, to the extent we're numb out there, to the extent we suppress the sorrow here, we also suppress the joy. Right? So
Mm.
if we allow the pain, the sadness, we also allow the joy and the love and the connection. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that is the thing that, I'll offer to our listeners is that I remember being in Colorado. I went to a retreat of Mark's at the Rocky Mountain Eco Dharma Center. If you guys don't know about the Rocky Mountain Eco Dharma Center, they offer affordable retreats for folks. So it's a great resource. But we're sitting in this flower field for 7 days. And if you've never sat in a wildflower field, I highly recommend it. And I come to meditation through and in and around psychedelics. And, Mark and I have had long conversations about the role that psychedelics can play in mindfulness and nature based practice. But for me, the wildflower field was like God's ayahuasca. It was like, you don't need, I mean, these master plants are there to tune us in, but the wildflower field is there every day. And I felt, yes, I want to call it joy. Yes, I want to call it happiness. But there's something much more complex about the feeling that you have when you're sitting present in the beauty of nature. I don't know what to term it. I don't have the word yet. But I agree. I think to allow yourself the time and space to feel that joy is proportional to your ability to also feel the pain and suffering of this moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, when the heart's open, it feels everything. The joy and the sorrow, the ecstasy and the grief. Yeah, yeah. I was reading a wonderful poem by a African American writer and birder. Wrote a wonderful birding book recently, and he has this poem called "Awe," as in awe, as you say in America, orgasms, orgasm. The quasi-erotic parasensual overwhelm of the senses, especially in response to nature and non-human beings. Like this kitty who wants to go out. I'm just going to let my kitty.
I actually appreciated, since folks will be listening to this and not watching it for the most part, Mark's cat has been sitting on a recliner with his back turned to the camera for most of the call. So I've been thinking like he's not Zoom approved. He has not signed his consent form.
Right. So he's out of here.
Yeah. But go on.
Yeah. So yeah, no, I think again, going back to this, bringing a quiet, meditative, mindful presence as we do in this work, but anybody can do if we go outside with a sense of quietness and openness and reverence and there's nature has this profound ability to touch us, to move us, and we feel. And I've read research about where most people feel a sense of the sacred, whatever the sacred is to you, the divine, the mystical, the mysterious, the unexplainable. It's mostly outside. It's mostly in nature. It could be looking into a marigold flower, or a redwood tree, or the flight of a swallow, or the sound of mourning doves, or so many things that just move us in the vastness of the ocean, or the sunsets that light up our skies. And there's something very profound about that experience, not just the joy, but the connection and the sense of meaning and a sense of place, and that to and I think it's really important that we remember that we all need to nourish ourselves, right? And TV or whatever other things we do for entertainment, they don't nourish in the way that nourishing that nature can nourish, or a deep, rich conversation can do that. But there's something so healing and resourcing about nature that I think it's essential that we have some daily contact, daily connection. That's just like food. It's like we wouldn't go without eating for a day. It's like, well, don't go out without looking up at the sky, or listening to a bird, or tending to a flower, or listening to trees, or whatever it is that's your doorway, because we all have different doorways. To let ourselves be enriched by that, right? The earth asks of us, and as indigenous teachers tell us, to pay attention, wake up to this beautiful earth, and then give thanks, offer gratitude for this mystery of the earth. And I think particularly those of us who care deeply about what's happening ecologically, that it's so easy to fixate on all that's wrong, all that's being lost, all that's being desecrated. And it's important that we attend to that, but it's also important to take in the reflection of the sky on water, and to listen to the sound of wind rustling leaves, and to seeing the first shoots of spring, and the sound of frogs at night, and all of those things. Right? Life is still continuing and still thriving despite what we've done to the earth as a species. And it's essential that we also acknowledge that, drink it in, because it's also true. Right? It's also what's happening. It's also beautiful medicine for us, and that can inspire us way more than the latest, news about acidification in the oceans or whatever. Because we're moved by beauty, we're moved by love, we're moved by passion, we're moved by inspiration, we're moved by, the phrase I talk about that drives my work is, we protect what we love. And we're more likely to protect if we'll let ourselves have contact and feel the love and the awe that comes from that connection.
I think the title of this episode is going to be soul food. Like, I really feel like that's what you're doing. I mean, people, as you say, position themselves in the work differently, shared horizon, different role to play, but this work is soul nourishing. I mean, I know that I feel that. I feel a juiciness in the work after these retreats, after time with you. I'm wondering if you can help our listeners sort of know where to find your work, so that if they're interested in feeding their souls in this journey towards a vibrant planet, they can kind of resource you if need be.
Yes, yeah. So the work Awake in the Wild you can find at awakeinthewild.com, and there's information about the work and different events happening there, and then and trainings and teacher trainings are on that website, and some information about the book Awake in the Wild. And then there's my own website, markcoleman.org, that has information about my retreats, and has lots of resources, guided meditations and books, and all kinds of things you can learn more about how to cultivate this awareness in nature. So so awakeinthewild.com and markcoleman.org.
What about Nature Conference or your Nature Summit?
Right. Yes, I will be co-leading with my partner Laurie a summit, the Nature Summit. We led one last year, and we have we will have an upcoming one next April. So, and you can also watch the previous one, naturesummit.com, I believe.
So many websites.
Yeah.
And then I know you have a new book coming out. So why don't you tell folks
I
about that?
do. Yes, I have a new book coming out, hopefully in October, and it's called
Field guide.
A Field Guide to Nature Meditation. Thank you. I was looking for that phrase. A Field Guide to Nature Meditation. And that will be available in bookstores and online, hopefully in October, and if not, by November for sure. Yeah. And it's 52 practices you can take anywhere that help you, and it'll be both a book and also audiobook, so you can take it on your phone or whatever outside and do some nature practice outside.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Ashley. Great to be with you.
Mm.